There's a peculiar quality to the morning light when you first wake from a dream so vivid, so architecturally complete, that for several lingering moments you're uncertain which world is the real one. Your heart still carries the emotional residue of that other place, that other logic, and the familiar bedroom around you seems almost like an intrusion, a less convincing reality imposing itself upon something truer. Terence McKenna would have recognized this threshold state, this liminal zone where the constructed nature of consensus reality becomes momentarily transparent. He spent much of his life trying to articulate a disturbing suspicion that most people spend their entire existence on the wrong side of that threshold, mistaking the dream for wakefulness, the prison for freedom, the script for spontaneity. Consider for a moment the architecture of your daily life, not the physical architecture of buildings and streets, though that certainly plays its part, but the invisible architecture of expectations, schedules, conversations, and concerns that structure your consciousness from the moment you silence the alarm clock until you close your eyes again at night. This architecture is so pervasive, so thoroughly normalized, that to question it feels almost like questioning gravity or the need to breathe. Yet McKenna insisted that this sense of inevitability, this feeling that things couldn't possibly be otherwise, is itself the primary mechanism of control. The most effective prison is one where the inmates don't realize they're incarcerated, where the walls are made not of stone but of unexamined assumptions, where the guards are internalized voices repeating, "This is just how things are." The culture you were born into didn't ask your permission before it began programming you. Before you could speak, before you could form critical thoughts, it was already there, downloading its operating system into your virgin consciousness. Language itself, that seemingly neutral tool of communication, came preloaded with thousands of years of accumulated assumptions about what matters, what's real, what's possible, and what's forbidden. Every word you learned carried within it an entire worldview, a way of passing experience that privileges certain aspects of reality while rendering others invisible. When you learned to call the sky blue and the grass green, you weren't simply acquiring descriptive labels. You were being initiated into a particular way of fragmenting the continuous spectrum of light, a culturally specific agreement about where one color ends and another begins. Indigenous languages often have entirely different color categories, passing that same spectrum in ways that English speakers find difficult to even perceive, let alone describe. But the programming goes far deeper than language. It extends into the realm of desire itself. Consider how thoroughly your culture has colonized your wanting. What do you want? A successful career, perhaps? A comfortable home? The respect of your peers? Financial security? A romantic relationship? These desires feel so intrinsically yours, so personal and self-generated, that to suggest they might be manufactured, installed, programmed, would seem absurd, even offensive. Yet McKenna would ask you to sit with this discomfort, to really examine whether these wants arose organically from your authentic being, or whether they were carefully cultivated by a system that requires your desires to align with its perpetuation. A culture that needs you to be a productive worker naturally encourages you to desire career advancement. A culture built on consumption requires you to experience lack, to always want the next thing, the upgraded version, the new model. The genius of this system is that it makes you believe these desires originate within you, that you're freely choosing to participate, when in reality, you're following a script written long before you arrived. McKenna often spoke of culture as a necessary illusion, but one that had metastasized beyond its original function. In its benign form, culture serves as a shared meaning-making system, a way for groups of humans to coordinate their actions and transmit accumulated knowledge across generations. It provides the frameworks within which we can communicate, cooperate, and create collective projects that transcend individual lifespans. But somewhere along the way, at least in the dominant Western industrial civilization, culture stopped being a tool that serves human flourishing and became instead an autonomous entity that consumes human potential as fuel for its own expansion. It no longer exists to serve you. You exist to serve it. Your life energy, your attention, your creative capacity, your very consciousness is harvested and converted into the maintenance and growth of systems that care nothing for your well-being or your authentic development. The mechanisms of this harvesting are everywhere, so omnipresent that they've become invisible through familiarity. Consider the modern workplace, that arena where most adults spend the majority of their waking hours. You trade your time, your energy, your one wild and precious life, as Mary Oliver called it, for currency that you then trade back for the necessities of survival that the system has carefully monopolized. Food. If your choices are constrained by invisible parameters you didn't create and can't perceive, if your desires themselves have been programmed, if the very categories through which you understand possibility have been pre-selected, then in what sense are you free? You're free in the same way a video game character is free to move within the boundaries of the game world, following the rules of the game engine, pursuing objectives defined by the game designers. The freedom is real within its domain, but the domain itself is a construction, and you never consented to its parameters. This is where McKenna's advocacy for psychedelic experience becomes comprehensible, not as hedonism or escapism, but as an act of cognitive liberty, a jailbreak from the cultural operating system. He wasn't interested in getting high. He was interested in getting real. The psychedelic state, when approached with courage and intention, temporarily suspends the default settings of consciousness, revealing the constructed nature of the reality tunnel you typically inhabit. Under the influence of psilocybin or DMT, the cultural programming becomes visible as programming. The arbitrary nature of social hierarchies, economic arrangements, and moral certainties becomes suddenly, viscerally apparent. You see that the emperor has no clothes, that the supposed solidity of consensus reality is more like a collective hallucination maintained through constant reinforcement and mutual agreement not to notice the gaps, the contradictions, the places where the illusion frays. But here's what's crucial to understand. McKenna wasn't suggesting that psychedelics show you a more real reality. That would be to simply replace one dogma with another. Rather, these substances demonstrate that reality is far more plastic, far more susceptible to consciousness, far more responsive to intention than the reductionist materialist worldview would ever admit. They prove that the map is not the territory, that the menu is not the meal, that the cultural narrative about what's real and what's possible is just one story among infinite possible stories. And if it's a story, if it's a construction, then it can be deconstructed. It can be rewritten. You are not obligated to accept the world as presented. You are not bound to the role that was assigned to you before you could refuse it. The system, of course, recognizes the threat inherent in this realization, which is why psychedelics remain illegal almost everywhere, classified alongside heroin and methamphetamine as substances with no medical value, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The war on drugs, that spectacularly failed campaign that has ruined millions of lives and consumed trillions of dollars, makes perfect sense once you understand it not as a public health initiative, but as a defense mechanism of the dominant reality tunnel. A population that has experienced ego death, that has directly perceived the constructed nature of the self and society, that has touched the infinite and returned with tales of dimensions invisible to the cultural mainstream. Such a population becomes difficult to govern, difficult to exploit, difficult to keep asleep. They've seen behind the curtain. They know the wizard is just a man with a microphone. They can no longer be relied upon to play their assigned roles with the requisite enthusiasm. This is why the system invests so heavily in what McKenna called dominant paradigm maintenance. Every institution, from education to entertainment, from news media to social media, from organized religion to organized science, plays a role in continuously reasserting the official story, the permitted version of reality. Education doesn't teach you how to think. It teaches you what to think. It instills not curiosity, but compliance, not creativity, but conformity. You learn to sit still, to follow instructions, to accept authority, to measure your worth by your ability to correctly answer questions you didn't ask about subjects you didn't choose. You learn that there are right answers and wrong answers, that reality is fixed and knowable, that experts have figured everything out, and your job is simply to memorize their conclusions. independent thought, wild speculation, unorthodox questioning. These are discouraged, pathologized, punished. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. The entertainment complex serves a similar function, though more insidiously because it masquerades as leisure, as free time, as the domain of your sovereignty. But watch what you watch, and ask yourself honestly, is this expanding your consciousness or managing it? Is this challenging the dominant narrative or reinforcing it? Most of what passes for entertainment is actually a kind of active sedation, a way of keeping you distracted and docile during those hours when you're not actively generating profit for someone else. The content varies, but the function remains constant, to fill your awareness with concerns and narratives that prevent you from asking dangerous questions about the nature and purpose of the system itself. Sports, celebrity gossip, political theatre that presents false binaries while protecting the actual power structure, endless streaming content designed to be just engaging enough to capture your attention, but not so challenging as to genuinely disturb your worldview. All of this is the modern equivalent of bread and circuses, crowd control masquerading as culture. The news media, perhaps more than any other institution, exemplifies what McKenna meant when he spoke of culture as a control system. On its surface, journalism claims to be the guardian of truth, the fourth estate, the mechanism by which power is held accountable and citizens are kept informed. But look more carefully at what information is selected for transmission and what is filtered out, what questions are asked and what questions are forbidden, what sources are deemed credible and what sources are dismissed as conspiracy theory or fringe thinking. The news doesn't present reality. It presents a carefully curated version of reality that serves specific interests and maintains specific power arrangements. It tells you what to pay attention to and, more importantly, what to ignore. It defines the boundaries of reasonable discourse, the Overton window of acceptable opinion. Stray outside these boundaries, question the foundational assumptions of the dominant paradigm, and you're labeled a crank, a kook, a danger to yourself and others. McKenna was particularly fascinated and horrified by the way Western industrial civilization had constructed a metaphysics, a deep cosmology, that rendered humans fundamentally alienated from nature, from each other, and from the cosmos itself. The Cartesian split between mind and matter, subject and object, human and nature, this philosophical move that placed consciousness in a separate category from the physical world, had catastrophic consequences that we're still living with. It created a worldview in which the universe is fundamentally dead, meaningless, mechanical, with consciousness as a bizarre accident, an anomalous epiphenomenon of sufficient neural complexity. In this story, you are essentially a ghost in a machine, a mind trapped in a meat body, piloting it through a cosmos that cares nothing for your existence and will continue indifferently after you're gone. This cosmology isn't just intellectually bleak, it's functionally useful for a culture based on exploitation and extraction. If nature is just dead matter, just resources waiting to be converted into commodities, then there's no moral impediment to strip mining mountains, clear-cutting forests, poisoning rivers, and driving species to extinction in the name of profit. If animals are just biological machines without inner experience, then factory farming becomes an engineering problem rather than an ethical catastrophe. If other humans are fundamentally separate from you, if their consciousness is locked away behind the impenetrable barrier of their skin, then their suffering becomes abstract, statistical, easy to ignore in pursuit of your own advantage. The materialist metaphysics that dominates Western thought isn't neutral scientific truth. It's a permission structure for domination. But McKenna insisted that this story, this cosmology, is precisely backwards. His experiences with psychedelics, particularly his legendary encounters with the dimethyltryptamine entity he called the self-transforming machine elves, convinced him that consciousness is not a byproduct of matter, but the fundamental ground of being. The universe, in this view, is not dead, but alive, not meaningless, but saturated with meaning, not mechanical, but creative, evolving, intentional. You are not a ghost in a machine, but a temporary localization of a cosmic awareness that permeates all of existence. The boundary between self and other, between human and nature, between consciousness and cosmos, is far more porous, far more negotiable than the culture would have you believe. This isn't mystical mumbo-jumbo or wishful thinking, though the dominant paradigm will certainly dismiss it as such. It's an empirical observation, replicable by anyone willing to undertake the voyage. Psychedelics reliably produce experiences of cosmic unity, of the dissolution of ego boundaries, of direct communion with a living, intelligent universe. These experiences are so consistent across cultures and time periods that they constitute their own form of evidence, a dataset that the materialist worldview simply ignores because it can't accommodate it without collapsing entirely. The phenomenon doesn't fit the theory, so the phenomenon must be discounted, written off as hallucination, as the brain misfiring, as anything other than what it presents itself as: genuine contact with dimensions of reality normally hidden from everyday awareness. McKenna, the separate self, the isolated individual, the skin-encapsulated ego, became the new center of gravity, and with it came all the pathologies we now accept as human nature: greed, fear, violence, exploitation, the will to dominate and control. But these aren't intrinsic to being human. They're symptoms of disconnection, the natural consequences of a worldview that tells you you're fundamentally alone in an indifferent universe where the only thing that matters is securing your own survival and comfort at any cost. The culture that arose from this disconnection, the culture we now inhabit, is essentially a trauma response masquerading as civilization. It's what happens when a species loses contact with its source, its ground, its cosmic context. Cut off from the direct experience of unity, humans created social hierarchies to simulate the connection they'd lost. Unable to access the sacred through direct experience, they created religious institutions to mediate between the human and the divine, conveniently placing themselves as the gatekeepers, the interpreters, the authorities who would tell you what the cosmos wanted from you. Lacking the direct sense of participation in a meaningful universe, they constructed elaborate systems of meaning through culture, through tradition, through stories that grew increasingly divorced from any living contact with the mystery. And here's the truly insidious part. This traumatized, disconnected culture then claims to be the pinnacle of human development, the end point of progress, the best we can do. It looks at the wreckage it's created, the alienation, the depression, the anxiety, the ecological collapse, the spiritual emptiness, and it declares this to be human nature. It pathologizes the longing for something more, something deeper, as escapism, as immaturity, as a failure to accept reality. It offers you antidepressants instead of ecstasy, Netflix instead of gnosis, shopping instead of ceremony, likes and follows instead of authentic communion. McKenna saw through this with devastating clarity. He recognized that what culture calls mental health is often just successful adaptation to a profoundly sick society, that what it calls maturity is often just the ossification of wonder into cynicism, that what it calls success is often just the refinement of your ability to exploit and be exploited. The well-adjusted citizen of a pathological culture is not someone to emulate, but someone to pity, someone who has successfully swallowed the poison and convinced themselves it tastes like honey. But awareness of the prison is the first step toward escape, and this is where McKenna's work becomes not just diagnostic, but potentially liberatory. Once you see the walls, once you recognize the programming, once you understand that the reality you've been inhabiting is just one possibility among infinite possibilities, you can begin the work of deprogramming, of remembering, of coming back to your senses in every meaning of that phrase. This isn't easy work. The culture has tremendous momentum, tremendous inertia. It will resist your attempts to wake up. It will offer you comfort and distraction. It will threaten you with poverty and ostracism. It will call you crazy, irresponsible, selfish. It will deploy every tool at its disposal to bring you back into compliance, to return you to your assigned role in the machine. And it will use your own internalized programming against you. This is perhaps its most effective weapon. You don't need external guards when you've installed the guard inside your own head, when you've internalized the voice of authority so thoroughly that it speaks to you in what sounds like your own thoughts. Be realistic, it says. You have responsibilities. You have bills to pay. This is just how the world works. You can't change anything. You're not special. Who do you think you are? You'll fail. You'll be alone. You'll lose everything. These thoughts feel like your own risk assessment, your own mature judgment, when they're actually the voice of the system speaking through you, using your own neural architecture to maintain its control. McKenna understood that breaking free requires more than intellectual understanding. You can't think your way out of a prison built from thought. You need experiences that shatter the paradigm, that demonstrate viscerally and undeniably that there are other modes of consciousness, other ways of being human, other possible relationships between self and cosmos. This is why he kept returning to psychedelics despite the legal risks, the social stigma, the dismissals from mainstream science. He had touched something, encountered something, learned something that couldn't be unlearned, and he felt obligated to testify, to bear witness, to serve as a kind of ambassador from the visionary realm to consensus reality, bringing back reports from the territories that the culture had declared non-existent. His descriptions of DMT experiences in particular challenge every assumption of materialist metaphysics. He spoke of entering hyperdimensional spaces more real than ordinary reality, encountering autonomous entities of staggering intelligence and creativity, receiving downloads of information too complex for language to capture. He described a realm where thought and matter are not separate categories, where intention directly shapes reality, where the boundary between self and environment dissolves into something like what mystics have called the One, the Tao, the ground of being. And he insisted that this wasn't hallucination in any dismissive sense. Hallucination implies seeing something that isn't there, but what if there are entire dimensions of reality that are always there, but normally hidden from perception? What if the doors of perception, as Blake and Huxley suggested, are usually locked, and psychedelics are simply keys? The resistance to this possibility, the cultural allergic reaction to the idea that reality might be far stranger and more magical than the materialist story allows, this resistance is itself revealing. Why does the culture invest so heavily in maintaining a narrow, impoverished view of consciousness and cosmos? Why does it treat altered states with such suspicion, such legal prohibition, such diagnostic pathologization? McKenna's answer was uncomfortably direct. Because a culture built on domination and control requires a populace that experiences itself as separate, as limited, as trapped in a meaningless universe where the only rational response is to grab what you can while you can. A population that has directly experienced cosmic consciousness, that knows itself to be an expression of an intelligent, creative universe, that has felt the walls of the ego dissolve into oceanic unity. Such a population becomes ungovernable, or at least far more difficult to manipulate. This is the deepest level of the prison, the most fundamental mechanism of control, the metaphysical narrative that tells you you're small, separate, powerless, temporary, fundamentally alone in an indifferent cosmos. This narrative is so thoroughly internalized, so completely normalized, that to question it feels like questioning the laws of physics. But it's just a story, and stories can be changed. The first humans who climbed out of the cave in Plato's allegory must have felt similar disorientation, similar resistance. The shadows on the wall seemed so real, so solid, so obviously the totality of what exists. The sunlit world outside the cave was almost too much to bear, too bright, too strange, too different from everything they'd been taught to expect. McKenna positioned himself as someone who had been outside the cave, who had seen the larger reality, and who came back to report that yes, it's difficult, yes, it's disorienting, yes, everything you thought you knew will be called into question. But the world outside is so much richer, so much more alive, so much more meaningful than the shadow play could ever be. He wasn't interested in converts or followers. He was interested in instigating direct experience, in encouraging others to conduct their own experiments with consciousness, to see for themselves rather than taking his word or anyone else's word for it. This is crucial to understand about McKenna's approach. He wasn't offering a new belief system to replace the old one. He was offering a method, a practice, a technology for expanding consciousness and accessing domains of reality that consensus culture denies or ignores. He positioned psychedelics as tools for empirical investigation of consciousness, comparable to telescopes and microscopes, but pointing inward rather than outward. Just as Galileo's telescope revealed celestial phenomena that contradicted religious dogma, just as microscopes revealed a world of bacteria and cells invisible to the naked eye, psychedelics reveal dimensions of mind and reality that contradict materialist dogma. The resistance to all three was similar: authorities defending the status quo against evidence that threatens their power. But McKenna also recognized that psychedelics alone weren't sufficient. You could have the most profound psychedelic experience, encounter the most mind-shattering revelations, and then return to consensus reality and gradually forget, gradually allow the insights to fade, gradually slip back into the default programming. The culture is too strong, too pervasive, too skilled at reabsorbing dissent and neutralizing threat. This is why he emphasized the importance of integration, of creating new cultural forms that could hold and transmit these non-ordinary insights, of building communities of practice that could support each other in staying awake. He saw this as a kind of evolutionary imperative. Humanity, in his view, was at a crossroads. The old paradigm, the paradigm of domination and separation and endless growth on a finite planet, was obviously unsustainable. We were driving toward a wall at increasing speed, and the only question was whether we would transform before we crashed or crash and then transform from the wreckage. The psychedelic experience, the visionary dimension, the archaic revival as he sometimes called it, this represented a possible evolutionary pathway, a way of upgrading the cultural software before it's too late. He spoke often of the archaic revival, by which he meant a return to the partnership society that he believed characterized early humans before the rise of domination hierarchies. This wasn't about primitivism or rejecting technology. It was about recovering a way of being human that honored the feminine, that valued direct experience over mediated authority, that understood humans as part of nature rather than separate from or superior to it. The archaic revival would cherry-pick from our past, taking the technologies and techniques that served life and leaving behind those that led to hierarchy, warfare, and ecological destruction. In this vision, psychedelic plants and fungi play a crucial role. They're not just drugs or recreational intoxicants. They're teachers, allies, evolutionary catalysts that have been partnering with human consciousness for millennia. The psilocybin mushroom, in particular, fascinated McKenna. He developed what he called the stoned ape theory, speculating that psychedelic mushroom consumption by early hominids might have catalyzed the rapid expansion of human consciousness, language, and culture. While this remains controversial and unprovable, it points to something important: the recognition that human consciousness isn't fixed or final, that it's co-evolved with our environment, including the psychoactive compounds we encounter, and that it remains potentially open to further transformation. The culture's response to this possibility has been, as mentioned, primarily prohibitive. But prohibition only addresses symptoms, not causes. The real question is, why are so many people seeking altered states in the first place? Why is there such hunger for something other than the consensus reality? McKenna would say, it's because consensus reality is impoverished, is insufficient, is failing to meet fundamental human needs for meaning, connection, and transcendence. The demand for altered states, whether through psychedelics, meditation, extreme sports, or any other means, reflects a healthy instinct that there must be more to existence than what the culture is offering. The mainstream culture does provide its own authorized altered states, of course. Alcohol is the obvious example, legal and socially acceptable, used to lubricate social interactions and numb the pain of existence. But notice the quality of the alteration that alcohol provides. It generally makes you more compliant, more suggestible, less critical, less capable of complex thought. It's a depressant, a damper, a way of turning down the volume on consciousness rather than expanding it. It serves the system perfectly by making the prison more bearable without ever questioning whether you should be in prison at all. The same could be said for most pharmaceutical interventions for anxiety and depression. They help you function within the pathological system, rather than questioning the system itself. Contrast this with psychedelics, which generally have the opposite effect. They make you less compliant, more questioning, more capable of seeing through consensus reality, more likely to have insights that contradict your cultural programming. They tend to be stimulants of consciousness rather than depressants, amplifiers rather than dampeners. They make you more yourself, not less, more aware, not less. This is precisely why they're illegal and alcohol isn't. The system can tolerate and even profit from substances that help you cope with alienation. It cannot tolerate substances that cure you of alienation by revealing its constructed nature. McKenna was particularly eloquent on the relationship between psychedelics and language. He argued that the development of language itself might have been catalyzed by psychedelic use, that the experience of psilocybin produces a distinctive glossolalia, a flow of novel linguistic forms and strange syntactic constructions that pushed early humans toward more complex communication. Whether or not this is historically accurate, there's something experientially true about it. Psychedelics do seem to enhance linguistic creativity, to produce floods of metaphor and analogy, to make connections between previously unrelated concepts. This is the opposite of the cliché that psychedelics destroy cognitive function. They actually enhance certain kinds of cognition, particularly pattern recognition, analogical thinking, and the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. This enhancement of cognitive flexibility is itself threatening to the dominant paradigm, which requires relatively rigid, binary thinking to maintain itself. The culture teaches you to think in terms of either/or, us versus them, right versus wrong, success versus failure. These binary categories make you manageable, predictable, controllable. But psychedelic consciousness tends toward both and, rather than either/or, toward paradox rather than certainty, toward multiple simultaneous perspectives rather than a single authorized viewpoint. It makes you comfortable with ambiguity, with contradiction, with the recognition that truth is often found in the tension between opposites rather than in the triumph of one over the other. This brings us to another of McKenna's key insights, that the culture is waging a war against the imagination. The imagination, the capacity to envision alternatives to what is, to conceive of other possible worlds, other possible ways of organizing society, other possible relationships between human and human, human and nature, human and cosmos. This capacity is perhaps the most dangerous force from the perspective of the status quo. Every revolution, every transformation, every liberation movement begins in someone's imagination, with someone saying, "It doesn't have to be this way." The imagination is where freedom lives, where possibility remains open, where the future can be invented rather than simply predicted as an extrapolation of the present. So the culture works systematically to colonize and constrain the imagination. It does this through education, which teaches you to color inside the lines, to follow instructions, to reproduce correct answers rather than generate novel questions. It does this through entertainment, which fills your imaginative space with pre-packaged narratives designed by committee to maximize engagement while minimizing challenge. It does this through social pressure, which punishes the weird, the strange, the different, the visionary. It does this through economic coercion, which ensures that the bulk of your time and energy goes towards survival and reproduction, leaving little spare capacity for imagining alternatives. And it does this through the suppression of the visionary state, the suppression of those experiences that most powerfully demonstrate that reality is far more plastic and responsive to consciousness than the materialist story allows. Psychedelics are technologies for liberating the imagination, for proving to yourself that your consciousness is not confined to the narrow bandwidth that culture insists is the totality of the real. When you've seen the impossible, when you've experienced the unthinkable, when you've entered spaces that couldn't exist according to consensus physics, but nevertheless are more vivid and detailed than ordinary reality, then your sense of what's possible expands dramatically. You become dangerous, not in the sense of being violent or destructive, but in the sense that you can no longer be relied upon to accept the official story, to stay in your lane, to limit your aspirations to what the system is willing to grant you. McKenna spoke often of the need for what he called cognitive liberty, the right to sovereign control over your own consciousness. In a genuinely free society, he argued, you would have absolute authority over your own neurological functioning, the same authority you presumably have over your own thoughts. The state would have no more right to dictate what substances you can use to alter your consciousness than it would have to dictate what books you can read or what ideas you can think. The fact that such cognitive liberty doesn't exist, that governments around the world claim the authority to criminalize certain states of consciousness, reveals something important about the nature of power and control in modern society. This prohibition, this war on cognitive liberty, is historically anomalous. For the vast majority of human history, the use of consciousness. Altering substances was not only permitted, but often sacred, incorporated into religious ceremonies and healing practices. The indigenous use of peyote, ayahuasca, iboga, psilocybin mushrooms, and countless other entheogens represents an unbroken tradition stretching back thousands of years. These aren't recreational drugs in the modern sense. They're sacraments, medicines, teachers, technologies for accessing wisdom and healing. The assault on these traditions, the criminalization of these practices, represents a kind of cultural genocide, the suppression of entire ways of knowing and being that threaten the modern industrial paradigm. But we should be precise about what's being threatened. It's not that psychedelics automatically turn you into a revolutionary, or that everyone who uses them becomes an enemy of the state. Plenty of people have psychedelic experiences and integrate them in ways that don't challenge the dominant paradigm at all. The New Age movement, for instance, often takes psychedelic insights and packages them in ways that are perfectly compatible with consumer capitalism. You can have your cosmic consciousness and your luxury SUV too. The real threat is more subtle. It's that psychedelics create the possibility of seeing through the game, of recognizing that the rules are made up, that the hierarchy is arbitrary, that the emperor has no clothes. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. This is why the experience is often described in terms of waking up, of having the scales fall from your eyes, of being red-pilled in the original Matrix sense before that term got co-opted by reactionary politics. There's a before and an after, and you can't go back to the before, you can't restore the innocence, you can't unknow what you know. You're permanently altered, permanently aware that consensus reality is just one channel among many, that you've been living in a very specific and very limited interpretation of what's possible. This creates a peculiar kind of exile. You're still physically in the society, still navigating its institutions, still speaking its language, but you're no longer fully of it. You've become an insider-outsider, someone who can pass, who can code switch, who can play the game when necessary, but who never forgets that it's a game. McKenna embodied this position. He could speak eloquently in the language of academia, engaging with philosophy and science and history, but he was always subtly undermining the foundations, always gesturing toward the inadequacy of the rational paradigm, always pointing beyond the limits of what the culture is willing to acknowledge. This is a lonely position, and McKenna was honest about the loneliness. Once you've awakened to the constructed nature of consensus reality, it becomes difficult to have certain kinds of conversations, difficult to get excited about the things that captivate most people, difficult to maintain the pretense that the concerns of the conventional world matter very much in the grand scheme of things. How do you care about your credit score when you've experienced the dissolution of the self into cosmic unity? How do you worry about your social media metrics when you've encountered entities from hyperspace who communicated more in 5 minutes than you've communicated in your entire life? How do you accept the 9-to-5 grind when you know, with absolute certainty, that reality is infinite and consciousness is primary, and you are literally the universe experiencing itself? And yet, you still have to live. You still need food and shelter. You still exist within a web of relationships and responsibilities. You can't simply opt out entirely without severe consequences. This creates a tension, a kind of double consciousness, where you're simultaneously participating in consensus reality and seeing through it, playing the game and knowing it's a game, maintaining the performance while being fully aware it's a performance. McKenna called this walking the tightrope, maintaining your balance between full immersion in the cultural illusion and complete withdrawal into the visionary dimension. He argued that this tension is actually productive, that the friction between consensus reality and visionary reality generates the spark of creativity, of novel insight, of cultural evolution. You need the grounding of ordinary consciousness to function, to translate the insights into communicable form, to test them against the stubborn resistance of matter. But you need the expansion of visionary consciousness to avoid getting trapped in the conventional, to remember that what is not all that could be, to access the creative source from which new possibilities emerge. The ideal is a kind of oscillation, a rhythm of expansion and contraction, journey out and return, what Campbell called the hero's journey. You leave the village, you encounter the extraordinary, you bring back something of value, you share it with the community. But what happens when the community doesn't want what you're bringing back? What happens when the insights you've gained, the truths you've touched, the realities you've experienced are completely incompatible with the cultural consensus? This is where McKenna's project becomes not just philosophical, but prophetic. He wasn't just describing an individual journey of awakening. He was attempting to catalyze a collective shift, a cultural transformation, a species-wide upgrade in consciousness. He believed that we were approaching what he called the transcendental object at the end of time, a strange attractor in the future that was pulling evolution forward, a kind of cosmic destiny that human history had been building toward. This concept, which he developed through his time wave zero theory and his interpretation of the I Ching, suggested that novelty, complexity, and consciousness were increasing over time, accelerating toward a moment of maximum novelty, maximum transformation, maximum shift. While his specific predictions about the date of this transformation, which he aligned with the end of the Mayan calendar in 2012, obviously didn't manifest in any literal way, the underlying intuition remains provocative, that we are living through a time of unprecedented change, that the old paradigm is visibly collapsing, that something new is trying to be born. And if you look at the world with this lens, it's hard to deny that something is shifting. The climate crisis, the sixth mass extinction, the rise of AI, the breakdown of traditional institutions, the widespread mental health crisis, the erosion of consensus reality itself through information warfare and deep fakes, all of these suggest a system in terminal decline, a culture that has pushed its internal contradictions to the breaking point. The question is whether we'll transform consciously, deliberately, with intention, or whether we'll collapse into chaos and rebuild from the ruins. McKenna's wager was that the psychedelic experience, the visionary gnosis, the direct encounter with the transcendent dimension, could provide the catalyst for conscious transformation. Not as a magic bullet, not as an easy fix, but as a tool, a technology, a key that could unlock potentials that currently remain dormant. He envisioned a society that had integrated the psychedelic experience, that had built institutions and practices around expanded states of consciousness, that took the visionary realm as seriously as it currently takes the material realm. What would such a culture look like? What kinds of art would it produce? What kinds of relationships would be possible? What kinds of problems could be solved? We can only speculate, but the hints we have from indigenous cultures that maintain psychedelic practices suggest it would be a culture with a much deeper sense of connection, both to nature and to each other. It would be a culture that valued direct experience over mediated authority, that honored the feminine and the intuitive alongside the masculine and the rational, that understood humans as participants in a living cosmos, rather than as isolated egos trapped in meat puppets piloting through a dead universe. It would be a culture that had room for the weird, the visionary, the mystical, not as aberration, but as essential dimension of human experience. But getting from here to there, from the culture we have to the culture we need, requires more than individual awakening. It requires collective action, cultural evolution, institutional transformation. McKenna was aware of this challenge. He knew that the system wouldn't voluntarily relinquish control, that power never gives up power without a struggle, that the transition would be difficult and dangerous and uncertain. But he also believed that the alternative, continuing on the current trajectory, was simply impossible. The old paradigm was already dead. It just hadn't stopped moving yet. The question was, what would replace it? This is where we find ourselves now, living in the gap between the death of the old world and the birth of the new, in what many traditions call the liminal time, the time between times, the bardo. It's uncomfortable, it's uncertain, it's frightening. All the old certainties are dissolving, all the old authorities are being questioned, all the old maps are proving unreliable. You can feel the anxiety of this moment everywhere, the desperate attempt to cling to what's familiar, to return to an imagined past, to make things normal again. But there is no going back. The only way out is through. And this passage through requires courage, requires vision, requires a willingness to let go of who you thought you were, what you thought was real, what you thought was possible. It requires a kind of death, an ego death, not just in the psychedelic sense, but in the existential sense. The death of your identification with the cultural program, your attachment to the role you've been playing, your investment in the consensus reality that's visibly falling apart. This death is terrifying because you don't know what, if anything, will be born on the other side. You have to walk into the unknown, into the darkness, trusting that there is something beyond the death, some transformation, some resurrection, some new way of being human that you can't even imagine from your current perspective. McKenna's testimony, his entire life's work, was essentially an encouragement to take this leap, to have this courage, to undergo this transformation. He wasn't offering certainty or safety or a clear roadmap. He was offering possibility, adventure, genuine freedom purchased at the cost of security. He was saying, the culture has lied to you about what you are, what the world is, what's possible. You are not a separate, isolated, powerless ego. You are an aperture through which the cosmos looks at itself. You are a localization of the infinite, a temporary crystallization of the eternal, a focal point of creativity in a creative universe. Your consciousness is not trapped in your skull. It's the same consciousness that animates all of existence, wearing a particular costume, playing a particular role, but never finally separate from the whole. This isn't a comforting message in the conventional sense. It doesn't offer you success in the culture's terms, or security, or the approval of authority. What it offers instead is freedom, authenticity, meaning, genuine participation in the creative unfolding of reality. It offers you the possibility of waking up from the dream that the culture has been dreaming through you, of becoming lucid in the midst of the collective hallucination, of taking responsibility for your own consciousness and your own reality. But this freedom comes with a price. Once you've seen through the illusion, you become responsible for what you do with that seeing. You can't plead ignorance anymore. You can't claim that you were just following orders, just doing what everyone else was doing, just trying to survive. You know now that you're complicit in the construction of reality, that your attention and your energy and your consent are what keep the system running, and that you have the power, however limited, to withdraw that consent, to redirect that energy, to place your attention elsewhere. This is the ultimate threat to the system. Not violence, not revolution in the conventional sense, but withdrawal, refusal, the simple act of saying no, I will not participate in this anymore. I will not lend my energy to the maintenance of a reality that I no longer believe in. What happens when enough people make this refusal? When enough people wake up from the cultural trance? When enough people remember who and what they really are? The system can handle revolutionaries who are trying to seize power, who want to replace the current hierarchy with a new hierarchy. What it can't handle is people who simply opt out, who create alternative cultures, who demonstrate through their living that there are other ways to be human. This is why McKenna emphasized the importance of what he called cultural engineering, the deliberate creation of new cultural forms that could embody and transmit alternative ways of being. He saw art, music, literature, festival culture, intentional communities, all of these as potential vehicles for a new culture, a new story, a new dream. The old culture won't be defeated through direct confrontation. It will become obsolete when enough people are living in a new culture that makes the old one irrelevant. But this cultural engineering requires vision, requires imagination, requires the courage to experiment with new forms without any guarantee of success. It requires a willingness to look foolish, to fail publicly, to try things that don't work. The dominant culture has centuries of refinement, centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to shape human behavior, how to manage populations, how to maintain control. Any alternative culture is starting from scratch, or at least from fragments, from the scattered remnants of pre-industrial lifeways, from indigenous knowledge that has survived colonization, from personal gnosis gained through psychedelic exploration or meditative practice or spontaneous mystical experience. McKenna positioned himself as a kind of cultural DJ, sampling from these various sources, mixing shamanic practices with quantum physics, ancient philosophy with cyberpunk futurism, ethnobotany with literary theory. He was deliberately eclectic, deliberately syncretic, refusing to pledge allegiance to any single tradition or discipline. This was partly temperament, but it was also strategy. The old culture is built on rigid categories, clear boundaries, specialists who know everything about nothing. The new culture, if it's to be genuinely new, needs to be fluid, hybrid, comfortable with paradox and ambiguity, willing to find wisdom wherever it appears, regardless of whether it fits the authorized categories. This approach has its dangers, of course. Without rigorous standards, you can slip into relativism, into the idea that all beliefs are equally valid, that there's no difference between wisdom and delusion, that anything goes. McKenna was aware of this danger, and he tried to navigate it by insisting on experience over belief, on empiricism over dogma. Don't believe him, he would say. Don't believe anyone. Try it yourself. Enter the psychedelic space with an open mind and see what you find. If you encounter the same phenomena he encountered, if you have experiences that match the reports from mystics and visionaries across cultures and centuries, then you have data. If you don't, if your experience contradicts his, then maybe he's wrong, or maybe you're accessing different dimensions, or maybe the territory is so vast that multiple conflicting reports can all be true. This empirical approach to consciousness exploration is what distinguished McKenna from many others in the psychedelic space. He wasn't interested in creating a belief system, a cult, a church of the psychedelic experience. He was interested in establishing a methodology, a protocol, a way of navigating non-ordinary states that could be refined through practice and shared experience. He wanted to demystify the mystical, to make it accessible, to remove it from the exclusive domain of priests and gurus and place it back in the hands of ordinary people willing to do the work. Because it is work. This is another important point that can get lost in the glamorization of psychedelics. These substances aren't recreational entertainment, despite how they're often portrayed. They're demanding, often difficult, sometimes terrifying. They will take you apart, and you have no guarantee they'll put you back together in a better configuration. They will show you things about yourself you didn't want to know, confront you with traumas you've been avoiding, dissolve the very structures of identity you've spent your life constructing. This is necessary work, maybe the most necessary work, but it's not easy and it's not fun in any conventional sense. McKenna was honest about this difficulty. He spoke about bad trips, about terrifying encounters, about times when he questioned his own sanity, about the price of admission to these realms. But he also insisted that the difficulty was worth it, that the truth gained through these encounters was worth any amount of discomfort, that knowing who and what you really are, even if that knowledge shatters your familiar world, is preferable to living in a comfortable illusion. This brings us to a fundamental question: why bother? If the culture is so pervasive, so powerful, so skilled at maintaining control, if waking up means exile and loneliness and the loss of the comforts that keep most people compliant, why not just take the blue pill, stay asleep, enjoy the steak even though you know it isn't real? Why undergo the difficulty, the danger, the disruption of awakening? McKenna's answer, never explicitly stated as such but implicit in everything he did, was that authentic being, living from truth rather than from illusion, knowing yourself and reality directly rather than through cultural mediation. This is what it means to be fully human. The comfort and security that culture offers in exchange for your sovereignty is a bad bargain. You're trading your birthright for a bowl of porridge, selling your soul for a pension plan, giving up your infinite nature to become a well-adjusted cog in a machine that's driving toward a cliff. And there's also this. Once you've touched the infinite, once you've experienced the dissolution of boundaries, once you've felt the love that moves the sun and other stars, as Dante called it, you can't go back to being satisfied with the substitutes that culture offers. You've tasted real food, and the processed garbage they serve in the cultural cafeteria loses all appeal. You've experienced authentic connection, and the transactional relationships that dominate modern life feel hollow by comparison. You've touched meaning itself, and the culturally approved meanings, the career success and social status and consumer goods, reveal themselves as the empty signifiers they always were. This is perhaps the ultimate function of the psychedelic experience in McKenna's vision. Not to provide escape from reality, but to reveal reality. Not to take you somewhere else, but to show you what here actually is when the cultural filters are removed. The journey to hyperspace, the encounter with entities, the experience of ego death, these aren't departures from reality, but arrivals at it. Not hallucinations, but the removal of the hallucination you've been living in your entire life. And what is this reality that's revealed when the filters fall away? McKenna's descriptions point towards something that mystics have been trying to articulate for millennia. A living cosmos, saturated with intelligence and intentionality, where consciousness is fundamental and matter is derivative, where the boundary between self and other is negotiable or illusory, where time is not what it seems, where every moment contains eternity and every point contains infinity. This isn't poetry or metaphor, though it requires poetic language to express. It's a direct apprehension of the actual nature of existence, normally hidden from everyday awareness, but always available for those willing to shift their mode of perception. The materialist paradigm can't accommodate this experience, so it dismisses it as hallucination, as the brain misfiring, as temporary insanity. But this dismissal reveals the poverty of materialism more than it reveals anything about the psychedelic experience. A worldview that can only account for a tiny sliver of human experience, that must pathologize or ignore everything that doesn't fit its narrow parameters, is not a comprehensive theory of reality, but a professional blindness, an institutionalized tunnel vision. McKenna saw the coming collision between the psychedelic perspective and the materialist paradigm as inevitable and necessary. One of them had to give way, and his bet was that materialism was already losing ground, that its inability to account for consciousness, its generation of meaninglessness and alienation, its complicity in ecological destruction, all of this was making it increasingly untenable. The psychedelic renaissance, the return of these experiences to Western culture after decades of prohibition, represented not a retreat into irrationality, but an expansion of rationality to include dimensions of experience that had been arbitrarily excluded. Science, properly understood, is simply a method for investigating reality through reproducible observation and experiment. There's nothing in the scientific method that requires materialism or that excludes consciousness from the domain of legitimate investigation. The problem is that institutional science has become wedded to a particular metaphysics, a particular set of assumptions about what's real and what's possible, and it defends these assumptions with the fervor of religious orthodoxy. Scientists who report data that contradicts these assumptions, who take psychedelic experience or parapsychological phenomena or mystical states seriously as objects of study, face career consequences, loss of funding, dismissal as cranks. This is not science, it's scientism, the conversion of a method into an ideology, the transformation of a tool into a weapon used to defend a particular worldview. Real science should be radically open to evidence wherever it leads. If the evidence suggests that consciousness can exist independent of brains, that intention can affect matter at a distance, that information can be accessed through non-physical means, then science should investigate these claims rather than dismissing them a priori as impossible. But to investigate them seriously would threaten the materialist paradigm, and the paradigm has tremendous institutional momentum, tremendous career investment, tremendous cultural authority to protect. McKenna's relationship to science was complex. He respected its methods and drew on its findings, particularly in ethnobotany and neuropharmacology. But he rejected its metaphysical claims, its presumption that the map it had drawn represented the totality of the territory. He saw science as one way of knowing among many, valuable in its domain, but not comprehensive, not adequate to the fullness of human experience or the strangeness of reality. He often invoked the idea of gnosis, the direct knowing that comes through immediate experience rather than through intellectual understanding or belief. This gnosis is what psychedelics provide access to, and it's what makes them so threatening to institutions that rely on mediated knowledge, on experts and authorities who tell you what to think rather than helping you discover how to know for yourself. A population with direct access to gnosis, to unmediated spiritual experience, to knowledge gained through personal investigation of consciousness, has no need for priestly intermediaries or academic gatekeepers. They become epistemologically autonomous, and this autonomy is perhaps the most dangerous thing from the perspective of systems built on controlling information and managing perception. The war on drugs, then, can be understood as an epistemological war, a fight to maintain the monopoly on knowledge and reality definition that institutions have claimed. It's not about protecting public health. If it were, alcohol and tobacco would be illegal and psychedelics would be legal. It's about preventing access to modes of knowing that threaten institutional authority, about ensuring that consciousness remains confined to authorized channels, about protecting the reality tunnel that serves power even as it immiserates most people. But this war is failing, has always been failing, because the desire for transcendence, for expanded awareness, for contact with the numinous, is too deep, too fundamental to human nature to be legislated away. People will seek these experiences regardless of legal consequences, will risk arrest and imprisonment for the chance to touch the infinite, to dissolve the ego, to experience the ground of being. This is a testament to the importance of these experiences, to their centrality to what makes us human. McKenna argued that the suppression of shamanism in Western culture, the long process beginning with the persecution of witchcraft and culminating in the modern drug war, represented a civilizational self-amputation, a cutting off of access to dimensions of experience that indigenous cultures had always maintained contact with. The costs of this amputation are evident everywhere: the epidemic of meaninglessness, the crisis of mental health, the destruction of the natural world, the social fragmentation, the violence and addiction and despair that characterize modern life. These aren't separate problems with separate solutions. They're all symptoms of the same underlying disconnection, the same loss of cosmic context, the same forgetting of what and who we really are. The healing, if it comes, will require reconnection, remembering, a recovery of those practices and perspectives that industrial culture has attempted to annihilate. The psychedelic renaissance is part of this healing, but only part. We also need to recover sustainable relationship with the land, reciprocal relationship with each other, humility before the mystery, openness to the more than human world, all the qualities that characterized archaic human societies before the rise of dominator culture. McKenna's vision of the archaic revival wasn't about literally returning to a pre-industrial lifestyle, though he had respect for people who chose that path. It was about cherry-picking from our evolutionary heritage, taking what worked, what served life, what honored the feminine and the intuitive and the ecstatic, and combining it with appropriate technology, with genuine knowledge, with the real achievements of science and philosophy. The result would be something entirely new, something that had never existed before, a high-technology shamanic culture, a society that had integrated the insights of both ancient wisdom and modern science, that valued both rationality and ecstasy, both individual autonomy and communal solidarity. This vision may sound utopian, and in some sense, it is. But utopianism, in the sense of imagining better worlds, of refusing to accept the current dystopia as inevitable, of insisting that things could be otherwise, is exactly what's needed. The dystopians have had their way for long enough. The people who say it's impossible, it's naive, it's unrealistic, human nature won't allow it, we've tried that before, and it failed. These people are the prison guards, the defenders of the status quo, the voices of the culture speaking through human mouths. They are the ones who are unrealistic, because the current trajectory is obviously unsustainable, obviously driving toward catastrophe. The realistic position, the pragmatic position, is to recognize that transformation is necessary and that it's possible, that humans have transformed before and can transform again, that we are not locked into any particular way of being, that culture is plastic and consciousness is fluid, and reality itself is far stranger and more responsive to imagination than we've been taught. This is the ultimate message that McKenna kept returning to in different forms. Wake up, the prison is not as solid as it appears. The reality you've been living in is constructed and therefore can be deconstructed and reconstructed. You are not who they told you you are. You are so much more, and the world is so much more, and what's possible is so much more than the cultural programming allows you to imagine. The question that remains is whether this awakening can happen fast enough, whether enough people can undergo the transformation before the old culture completes its project of ecocide and brings the whole enterprise crashing down. McKenna alternated between optimism and pessimism on this question. Sometimes he seemed to believe that the transcendental object at the end of time was pulling us toward transformation, that some kind of cosmic teleology was guiding evolution toward ever greater complexity and consciousness. Other times he acknowledged that we might fail, that the transformation might not happen, that humans might prove unable to overcome the limitations of our evolutionary psychology and our cultural conditioning. But whether or not success is guaranteed, whether or not the outcome is certain, the work remains the same. To wake up yourself, to help others wake up, to create islands of sanity and beauty and authentic culture in the midst of the collapsing mainstream, to plant seeds that might flower even if you never see the bloom, to maintain faith not in any particular outcome, but in the value of the work itself, the worthiness of the attempt, the dignity of trying to live from truth rather than from illusion. This is what McKenna modeled in his own life. He didn't claim to have all the answers. He didn't present himself as a guru or a savior. He was simply someone who had been to the territories, who had seen what he had seen, who felt obligated to report back, to testify, to serve as a kind of scout for consciousness, mapping realms that the culture claimed didn't exist. He knew that his maps were provisional, that others would come with different maps, that the territory itself might be ultimately unmappable. But he kept drawing maps anyway, kept refining his descriptions, kept trying to find language adequate to the task of conveying the inconveyable. And in doing so, he kept alive a possibility, a vision, an invitation to others who might be feeling the same disquiet, the same sense that something is deeply wrong with consensus reality, the same intuition that there must be more to existence than what the culture is offering. His voice reached across the void and said, "You're not crazy. You're not alone. What you're sensing is real. The culture is a control system. You can wake up. You can be free. And here are some tools that might help you, some practices, some substances, some ideas that might crack open the shell of your conditioning and let the light in." Whether you follow his specific path, whether you use psychedelics or meditation or art or some other practice, the fundamental message remains relevant. Question everything, especially the things that seem most obvious and unchallengeable. Investigate consciousness directly, rather than accepting second-hand reports. Trust your own experience over cultural authority. Cultivate the courage to see what's actually there, rather than what you've been taught to see. And once you've seen through the illusion, live from that seeing, rather than falling back into comfortable blindness. The culture will not thank you for this work. It will not reward you for waking up. It will more likely punish you, subtly or overtly, for refusing to play your assigned role, for asking uncomfortable questions, for pointing out that the emperor has no clothes. But the alternative, staying asleep in a world that's burning, maintaining your complicity in a system that's destroying itself and everything else, this is no longer viable, no longer tolerable, no longer morally acceptable. So wake up. That's the message. That's always been the message. Wake up from the dream they've been dreaming through you. Reclaim your sovereign consciousness. Remember who you are beneath all the cultural programming. Live from that remembering, and help others do the same. The prison they built to keep you asleep is real, but it's not as real as you are. The power they wield over you depends entirely on your continued consent, your continued participation in the illusion. Withdraw the consent, refuse the role, step out of the script, and you discover something extraordinary. You were never actually trapped. The door was never locked. You can walk out any time. The question is, will you?